Hello everybody. So we kind of got a confluence of assignments going on here. You got the find measure assignment, and you know, one of the best places to go to look at a quality to start your find and measure assignment is probably the repertory grid as it related to good teachers versus less than good teachers. You developed a list of constructs that were measurable. You had them on a bipolar continuum, right? You said, hey, for example, clarity. Is the teacher clear or unclear? Clarity is desired. So the idea is, if clarity is desired, then how do we assess applicants on their ability to be clear? So we need to find a measure, find a measure that assesses clarity. Now, if you're hung up on the word instrument, an instrument is a measure, right? So how do you measure someone's heart rate? Well, you take their pulse, right? But you look at a watch or use a stethoscope, right? And a stethoscope is an instrument to assess heartbeat. So if you want to measure self-esteem, what instrument do you use? Probably the Rosenberg self-esteem scale. So the instrument measure, kind of same terminology. So if clarity is important, and I say, well, hey, one of the top things we found on a repertory grid for teachers is their ability to be clear. Hello, Annika. How's Annika today? So Annika says, what makes a teacher clear or what makes a teacher unclear? Well, do we have some measure of clarity? Now, if you have a lot of history in psychometrics, that is mental measurements, then you might say, oh yeah, so-and-so had a measure for clarity, so does somebody else. But maybe you don't know that. Maybe you don't, I don't know, because I'm new at this. So what do? Well, we go to Google Scholar, and we go measure of clarity and see what's out there. And it might take a while to search this down, right? But that's part of find a measure. That's why it's called find a measure assignment, is can you find a measure of clarity if you believe clarity is an important person specification derived from your job analysis. So you can pull it out of the repertory grid, use it as the basis of your find a measure assignment, and then you answer all the questions. Is it a good measure? Is it a bad measure? How do I know? Has it been empirically tested? What is the reliability of the measure? What's the validity of the measure? So there's probably people who've used, if it's a common measure, have used it before in different contexts and then have done the statistical analysis so that they have numbers that demonstrate reliability or validity in a certain context. That's what you're looking for. But notice, it's on you. That's the whole ideal. That's why it's called find a measure, because you need to find a measure. You need to determine which measure is appropriate, you believe to be appropriate, and then you need to be able to go and find that. That will be part of your work in that regard. Okay? So that's a little bit more there. Let's talk a little bit about understanding frequency distributions. Let's talk about correlations and how we use these within the context of this class. So a frequency distribution defined is a display of scores on a sample for a specific characteristic or measure. So let's suppose I have 100 applicants and I'm going to hire 5, right? And what I'm trying to do is prioritize or rank order people on the basis of their scores. One thing that's important in using a measure is understanding how the measure performs. And one way to get at that right off the bat is frequency distribution. So I measure performance in a classroom, right? And I give an exam, and then we look at the frequency distribution and we see how the scores are distributed for that particular measure, that is that particular exam at any given time. And frequency distributions have different characteristics that give us information about how the measure is operating. Right? If we're using IQ scores, then we know that we end up with that bell curve, that nice even frequency measure. Other frequency measures, not so much. Now I want to give you some examples of different types of distributions that we observe in frequency distributions. So performance-based measures, one thing to consider is that in the IQ measure we look for a normal distribution, but other measures in fact might not have normal distributions. They might stack up at one end or the other, representing that term skew, that the frequency distribution is skewed right or left, right? So performance-based measures may or may not normally distribute. It depends on the extent, the large extent, the nature of the measure, and also the number of people who have taken the measure. To find a normal distribution when we only have maybe 8 or 10 people taking a measure is probably not going to happen. We probably need more like 100 data points to assess a frequency distribution more reliably. Now, I was messing around with a measure, and we didn't talk about it in this class much. I was working on a couple students with it. A measure to assess the level of predatory instinct that someone might have. And the idea was that certain occupations we don't want to probably hire people who have a high predatory trait or instinct. That is, certain jobs we shouldn't be putting people in position who like to prey on others. School teachers shouldn't want to prey on their students. Police officers shouldn't prey on the public. You kind of get the idea. So what I was thinking, if it's possible to assess someone's predatory instinct, maybe then we could screen them out from certain occupations. And I was thinking significantly in terms of police officers. There's a chilling example of the U.S. Marshals Service, and there's a picture a couple of years ago of the U.S. Marshals all wearing t-shirts that they had purchased for themselves. And I'm going to paraphrase the Hemingway quote, because it's a quote from Hemingway that said, "The most interesting animal to hunt on the planet is man." And it's like, these guys are out serving warrants, but I don't know that they should be displaying this desire to hunt down people. That's a predatory instinct. And if we think back in the day when I was growing up in Los Angeles, police department has as its motto to protect and to serve. Right? Nowhere did that motto state the job of LAPD is to prey upon the civilian population. And people who do prey upon others, right, might be more inclined to pull out their pistol and use it to various bad outcomes. So in attempting to develop this measure of predation, which I've done over the last 10 years with a variety of students, more just as an activity to keep my foot in the research game rather than take it seriously, one of the things that we have to do when you develop a new measure, a measure of predation, is say, what is this measure similar to, and then how is it different? So you're often correlating that measure to another measure. One of the measures that we used to correlate or to see how our measure was operating was the youth psychopathy inventory. So I gathered quite a bit of data on the California youth psychopathy inventory, measuring the level of psychopathy, especially designed for young people, but the way the questions were constructed was really useful as a model. I gave this to my psych and law classes over a period of time. So what I can do is I can show you some data that represents different frequency distributions and kind of explain how that works with actual data. So the youth psychopathy inventory scores for, it was back in August 08, of OSU Psych 485 students, now 4485, right, because this is quarter system. That is, how did people score on the youth psychopathy inventory look? And what we see here then in this frequency distribution is a relatively normal distribution. That is, it's relatively bell-shaped. And we see that the lower the number, right, the less psychopathic traits that are in position. And you can see that the scale taps out at about 200. So we're dropping off. We only have like 3 people that score above 130 on this measure. The bulk are down around 91 to 105%. Maybe you can say, you know, from 80 to a score of 120 represents the bulk, which is not psychopathic hardly at all. So this was the overall measure. But the measure, and this is when we talked about factor analysis, the measure is also got many sub-factors in it. So the total psychopathy score is represented here. But how about the subscales? So maybe there's 5 questions out of 40, 5 questions out of 100, whatever the scale is, that represent a certain sub-construct. In this case, to what extent do people like to or endorse using charm in a dishonest manner? So they call that subscale, yeah, duh, dishonest charm. And what do we see? Well, we see in this sample then that in fact the level of dishonest charm is represented, and this is the frequency. So the class, the folks in the class did to a certain extent kind of endorse using charm to get what they wanted, even if they're fibbing in so doing. So this gives me a picture of this particular class, and if I believe that this class is representative of the population, then this is kind of how the world works, that there's a lot of people who are willing to use dishonest charm. Now, if I wanted to assess genuineness, let's suppose, that I want my applicants, I want people who are genuine, who don't bullshit other people, who don't blow smoke up their ass, if you like those terms, then you can see where this subscale might be useful. That is, if people endorse using dishonest charm, then maybe I want to, kind of reverse score this and say that those people are less appealing that want to use dishonest charm. But if I'm kind of a shady guy operating, a big car dealership, and I think that charm, saying whatever you need to say to get the deal done, i.e. using dishonest charm, is something that I'm seeking, then I might use this measure to find people who are capable of engaging in dishonest charm. So the frequency distribution just allows us to see how this measure operates in a sample. Now this other one, another component in the youth psychopathy inventory was called thrill seeking. And people differ in the desire to engage in thrill seeking. And for a college audience, you can see here that in fact there's a relatively high level of thrill seeking, which kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Because that would be kind of a late adolescent to early adulthood kind of issue. And if we were to further separate this, I can almost guarantee you that what drives the higher effect here, this is the men and this is the women. And I don't mean to be sexist, but that's usually the way those play out, that men are probably bigger thrill seekers on average than women are. Obviously, there are exceptions, right? But again, we use the frequency distributions to understand the data. Now, next up, let's look at this one. Now, remorselessness. Okay, now we're getting into a different area, because remorseless is having no sorrow, no sympathy, that kind of thing. And in fact, we see a much lower endorsement relative to the other questions, the other subscales for remorselessness. And this is kind of our truest bell-shaped curve, if you will. So, yeah, we have to be tough sometimes, is a saying, but for the most part, being sorrowful is probably a beneficial quality. Okay? Now, let's take another one that kind of really shifts the whole distribution. That is lying. So here we see a relatively low endorsement for lying, lower numbers over here, and we see that fewer and fewer people in the sample endorse lying, general lying as a technique. And notice, dishonest charm and lying are differentiated in this measure. They're both components of the California Youth Psychopathy Inventory, but they're captured by different questions. And factor analysis allows us to determine are the questions that ask about lying different, fundamentally different, conceptually different than the questions that ask about dishonest charm. And this measure of youth psychopathy inventory has undergone a huge amount of testing, factor analysis, so it's pretty well supported that those two constructs are in fact different. We're not talking about the same things. So initially, we can take a big overview and look like, how did the class perform on this exam, or how does the class endorse lying versus not lying? That's the big picture. Now we can look for relationships, and if we want to look for a relationship between two subscales or between two radically different constructs, right? We use what device do we use? Yeah, we use scatter diagrams. Now, remember, scatter diagrams would also be, okay, so we want to assess, let's go back to dishonest charm, and we want to sell cars. Does dishonest charm allow someone to, or enable someone to sell more cars? So now what we do is we measure applicants on their dishonest charm, and we hire these people because they display the greatest amount of dishonest charm. Then we correlate it with the car sales 1 year, 2 years down the road on the job, and see if the dishonest charm level predicted the number of car sales. So when we're assessing relationships, you know what we do. We go back to the good old friend scatter diagrams. Now, I'm sticking with the California Youth Psychopathy inventory through most of this this lecture. What are we going to look at here? Well, what is the relationship of the two variables captured in the YPI, that is manipulation versus lying? And notice that we're looking essentially for our trend line, and we have a pretty strong relationship, right? It's an R squared 0.5. So what this means is people who scored, the way they answer the question on manipulation, is it good to manipulate people, right, correlates really highly with the people's endorsement of lying to others. So what we see is those who endorse manipulation tactics also endorse lying to a greater degree, and we see that relationship there. Those who are less manipulative employ lying less as well, right? So it's about measuring the relationship, and this is our good old friend, the scatter diagrams. So what about, there's another, callousness versus remorselessness. So how hard can I be on people and watch their suffering and not care? And then how unlikely, hi Monica, you're such a sweetie, am I to apologize for my past behaviors? And what we see is a very strong relationship between people's answer on the questions for callousness as their answer on the questions for remorselessness. Now notice, any of the measures that you use can be either correlated to see how they operate together, right, within the context of the employment screening, or you can correlate any employment screening measure with any performance measure on the job performance measure. And this is one way that you validate, right, is you're able to predict. And you say, hey, look, we measure dishonest charm, and those who endorse using dishonest charm, we correlate that with future sales, that is when someone's been hired and on the job. And then we can make a case that dishonest charm is an effective measure of on-the-job performance, that is selling cars. Now notice, this is not in a positive context necessarily, but if we just keep the value judgments out of it, it does in fact predict. So if you want to sell more cars and you're okay with dishonest charm, then you probably want to assess candidates' dishonest charm because you can validly demonstrate that it predicts their car sales. Hello Penelope, how you doing? Huh? What's Penelope? You're such a good girl. So everyone's making I brought all the cats up here. I told them to all come up because they were downstairs driving Rebecca crazy. Thank you for sneezing on me, sweetie. Okay. So it's about measuring the association, and that's how we do it. And sometimes there's a little, if any, any association. So let's look at this. What's the association of lying versus grandiosity? Grandiosity is a component of narcissism. There really isn't much association at all. You can see the line is almost flat. The R squared is 0.03. Nothing to write home about there. So there's, from here on out, that people who endorse lying aren't necessarily narcissists or have the grandiose component of narcissism. And if, let's take it in the other context, if I'm using, let's say, one of these variables to predict on-the-job performance, and over time I see that it doesn't predict it well, that it's a low correlation between the employment measure and the performance measure, then I go backwards and say, well, I don't know that it's valid for me to be measuring this in candidates if it doesn't predict what I was hoping it predicted down the road. Okay? So this is how we use scatter diagrams and frequency distributions to better understand the measures we're using. Okay? Now, when we go to scatter diagrams, though, I want to channel my old stats professor, Dr. Newcomb, here for a minute and talk about Anscombe's quartet. He showed us this, and it's really a mind-blowing kind of piece of work. The statistician F.J. Anscombe used it to demonstrate the importance of graphing data, and Newcomb was crazy about this. He says you have no business looking at that R or the R squared until you've actually physically looked at the scatter diagram. And here's why. We're going to look at 4 data sets, right? And these 4 data sets share, 4 different data sets share these elements in common, right? That is, the mean of each x variable is 9. The variance of each x variable is 10, right? The mean of each y variable is 7.5. The variance of each y variable is 3.75. The correlation between each x and y variable is 0.8, which is super high correlation, right? And the regression line is the same. So 4 data sets with all those same numbers. And yet look at the scatter diagrams. Set 1 is what we would expect to be a typical scatter diagram, a typical data set. But look at set 2. That's drastically different, right? We look at set 3. Set 3 is basically all the points arrayed on the data line except for one outlier that's pulling the line up. And then look at set 4. Set 4 is mind-boggling because there's no variability whatsoever in the one variable. Crazy. So, Dr. Newcomb was always saying, if you don't see these, if you don't look at the actual set, then you don't know the shape of the distribution based simply on the R number and the means. You must generate a scatter diagram and look at it. Fortunately, you don't have to do them in graph paper anymore. You can ask Excel to spit one out for you in short order, not like when I was in school and you had to buy graph paper for your stats class and do it that way, at least when I first started. So let's break here and we'll come back to part 2 in a minute. All right, Penelope? All right.